Hello, this is Dr. Lori. Welcome to this overview of study designs. In this video, what I'd like to do is share with you sort of the basic idea of what does it mean to design a study. And probably the best way to categorize this based on what you've already learned about is to think about it in terms of the research process. So you've learned about asking a question, and then that leads to study design or designing a study, collecting the data, analyzing the data, and then making some kind of inference or sharing it, which often leads to more questions. You've seen this research cycle before. For this particular video, we are going to be living right here, designing the study design. And what study design means, probably the most concise definition that I've heard, is if you could write down all of the details about a particular study in enough detail so that somebody else would be able to duplicate that study, then you have described that study design very well. So the study design includes how did we collect our sample. Remember, we start with a population. From that, we often draw a sample of individuals. We don't study everybody just because it would be prohibitive, either cost or time. And then from that, we measure things. We measure things called statistics, and then we infer back about the population parameters. So study design is all about how do we find out who we want to include in our study, and then how do we measure those variables that we are wanting to collect. So I like to break this down and present this in terms of a grid, and I've drawn it here. Here's my famous grid, maybe infamous. So here's the basic idea is that I have five general types of studies, and each of those types of studies can be done among groups or among individuals. And by far and away, most of the time when we're doing studies, we are studying one person at a time. Occasionally we will be studying groups, and today I'm only going to be sharing with you one type of study among groups. So I'm going to kind of get rid of all of these up here. It is possible to do studies on groups in those areas, but we're going to be filling in this this table and then referring back to it throughout the class, throughout multiple Cohort classes, so that you can see how these different types of studies are maybe similar to each other and how they're also different from each other. Another thing to keep in mind is that as we're going through this process, I'm going to be giving you some of the key features. And that key feature often will give you a clue about the strengths and the limitations. And you'll see what I mean when we get a little bit farther through this presentation. So often something that is a strength, it's a double-edged sword. That same thing can be a limitation for a particular study design. So let's start off here on the left-hand side, and the first type of study design is I'm going to put up here at the top report. That's a key word that will help you remember about that. Think about the last time you wrote a report. Maybe it was a book report. You wrote about a book. And so this report, down here under individuals, this is going to be called a case report or a case series. Now, many textbooks do not talk about case reports and case series, but I think it's an important one to include, partly because it's often included in testing kind of scenarios, but you'll see a lot of this in the public health field where somebody says, hey, I saw something interesting. What a case report is, the key feature is that somebody noticed something unusual and they would like to share that with their colleagues. So maybe they saw an unusual presentation of a particular disease, or it was in a person who was a different age range than they would normally see. So they write it down and they submit it to a journal, and you'll see these, and they're written down. They're they're designed to share information among colleagues so that people can see what's going on. They're like, hey, have you seen the same thing that I'm seeing? There's no comparison group. And we'll be talking more about each one of these different kinds of study design in more detail. So here I'll just be sharing kind of the overview. A case report is going to be different from some of the other study designs where we also have this word case. So that's partly why I like to share that, not because it's just so common, but also because it can be confused with other things. This next grouping, I'm going to call, the key word here is slice. You've all seen a slice of bread. If we took that whole loaf and we slice one little piece out of the middle, that's what we're doing in this case. So if we were to do that in individuals, we call it a cross-sectional study design. And cross-sectional studies are very, very, very often done with surveys. So you'll hear the term cross-sectional survey. A survey is not the only type of cross-sectional study design that can be done, but it's very common, and it's an easy way to think about a cross-sectional study. Basically, the key feature of a cross-sectional study is that I just am taking a slice, maybe a specific day for each person that I'm studying. And so I hand you a survey. I say, could you please answer these 10 questions? You hand me the survey back, and I'm like, thank you, that's awesome. Now I know some things about you. Maybe I asked your age or your race, ethnicity. Maybe I asked if you use a certain product. Maybe I ask if you take vitamins or if you have a specific health problem. And so here's my cross-sectional survey. I can get information about people really, really quickly. So I think about that as a slice. It's a cross-section through time. The kind of study that is done that's the most common one among groups is also a slice in time, but we call that an ecological study design. And ecological studies can also be other types of study designs that are not cross-sectional. However, when somebody in the health profession says an ecological study design, this is almost always what they're referring to as an ecological cross-sectional study. And so we're studying groups of people, and you see this a lot when we're, say, comparing cities to each other or comparing countries. Maybe we know the mean life expectancy in a variety of different countries, and we also know what kinds of foods they eat, and we also know if they have good air quality, and so those kinds of things on a population, on a group level, we have information, and that is called an ecological study. And those most commonly are a slice in time. In 2019, how did these different countries compare to each other? How did these different cities compare to each other, or states within the United States? So we can compare these on a group level, and that's called an ecological study design. The next kind of study design is based on assembling groups based on outcomes. And so I like to think about this as our outcomes, as kind of a key word. And this is called, when we study among individuals, this is called a case control study. We collect a bunch of cases and we collect a bunch of controls, see how that's the outcome. We know if they have the disease or not. We collect them based on their outcome, and then we compare. Are cases more likely to be exposed to a certain substance, or to eat a certain food, or to have a certain health habit? And this is the one right here. Let me get a different color, blue. This is the one that is commonly confused with case reports. And so this is part of the reason that I want to share with you about case reports, is because case reports are not case control studies, and vice versa. A case control study, we're collecting a bunch of people based on their outcome. We have both cases and controls. We have a comparison group, whereas case reports, we do not have a comparison group. So case control, we collect up a bunch of people who have the disease, and then we collect comparison group that does not have the disease, and we want to see if they have the same exposure pattern. The next kind of study design I like to think about is a group. We have a clearly defined group of people. We collect them all up, and then we would like to see what happens to that group over time. And so this is called a cohort study. A cohort study can be done prospectively. It's called a prospective cohort, which means starting now and going into the future. A cohort study can be done retrospectively, in other words, starting a long time in the past and coming forward to the present time. Can be kind of a combination of that. We have lots of great examples of this in public health. The Framingham Heart Study collected a whole bunch of people that all lived in Framingham, the city of Framingham. We have at our institution, we're somewhat well known for having the Adventist Health Study. And the Adventist Health Study, we collected up a bunch of Adventists, we asked them a whole bunch of questions about their exposure, and then we followed them forward in time. That cohort, we followed that group or that cohort forward in time to see who ended up developing specific health problems, or what were the kinds of things that they died from. And so that's called a cohort study design. And then the final one is that the researcher assigns the exposure, and that word assigns, and I'll just put EXP for exposure, assigns exposure. That is the key thing about this particular study design, and it's called an experimental, or it can be called a clinical trial. Those are interchangeable, an experimental study design or a clinical trial study design. And when we're actually using a group again, but in this case, we are collecting up people and we are assigning people to be exposed to a specific thing. We are assigning them to take a specific medication that we think might be helpful for their disease. Or maybe we will assign some people not to take that medication. And so once a researcher assigns exposure, this becomes a really different kind of a thing, and there are a lot more things to be thinking of in terms of these strengths and limitations of the study design. I will be talking in separate videos about each one of these, so don't feel like you have to know everything about all of them. But what I wanted to do is to give you this framework, to give you this grid, partly because this particular sequence that I just mapped out, kind of here from left to right, that is considered by many people to be considered like the strength of evidence. Down here with case reports and the slice, the cross-sectional or ecological, they don't have very strong evidence about a particular thing. But as soon as we're getting farther up, farther to the right here, these are becoming stronger and stronger and stronger evidence in terms of the kinds of questions that we're asking, the research that we're actually doing. And so it becomes, the strength of evidence increases as we go from left to right. So experimental studies are considered the strongest level of evidence. The other thing to think about as we're going through this table is this is often the process of discovery. We start off with, let's say somebody says, hey, I noticed something. I noticed this bizarre pattern of things. And so we say, okay, well, let's just ask a bunch of surveys. Let's ask a bunch of people, kind of what they do. Cross-sectional, little slice, doesn't take very much time, so that's awesome. And then we either progress on to a case control study or a cohort study, and we gather more information about that particular pattern of relationship between exposure and outcome. Then we say, okay, if we really want to nail this on the head, we need to assign exposures, so that we're not just finding something that's not really there that we think we see, but we need to control this. We need to put it under experimental conditions so that we can see if what we think is happening is actually happening. So this is also almost a timeline of how research progresses. We ask a question, and then we go through this process, and then it leads to more questions, more in-depth and more specific questions. The other thing that I like to point out is that this also lends itself to two other things. First of all of the things over here in these first four columns, these are considered observational. And what that word observational means is I'm observing what happens when people have free will and they are just going about their life. Whereas experimental, I'll put that up here, EXP. These are kind of like the two big categories of study designs, observational and experimental. Experimental means I assign you to be exposed to something. Observational, I'm just watching what happens when you pick your own thing. You assign yourself. You choose what you're going to have for breakfast, or whether you exercise, or what job you have, or those kinds of things. So observational, I'm observing what's happening out there. Experimental, the researcher is assigning people to have a specific exposure. The other kind of classification is when in research we like to think we're either we're generating hypotheses, where in other words, and we'll hear more about this hypothesis. I'll make an abbreviation here. HO stands for hypothesis generating. In other words, I'm looking to see what patterns I can find, and I'm generating hypotheses about what questions I might be able to test. Whereas over here on the right hand side, most often we're using these to test hypotheses. So here's my H sub 0, that's an abbreviation for hypothesis, testing. So very often you'll hear people say, well, that was a case report, or that was a cross-sectional study, that was hypothesis generating. You can't test a hypothesis with that study design. And most of the time, in generalities, that's a good rule of thumb. So thinking about whether something is hypothesis generating, or whether it's has the ability to actually test hypotheses is also a very good distinction. So again, we'll be talking about each one of these study designs in more detail, and talking about their key features and how that key feature really lends itself to be both a strength and a limitation of that particular study. Thank you so much for joining me.